If you go to Wikipedia and you look up sex club, and in categories of sex clubs, it says that black gay sex clubs were started by Alan Bell.
Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. Today's episode is part of our series, Underground Press, the untold stories of literary rebellion and the figures who redefined the boundaries of literature and publishing. This episode features Alan Bell, the trailblazing publisher and activist behind Gaysweek, one of only 3 queer weekly publications in the world at the time of its launch in 1977, and the first in New York, making him the first African-American publisher in that space. After returning to Los Angeles, he founded Blackjack, a pioneering safe sex club during the AIDS crisis that later grew into BLK Magazine. Running from 1988 to 1994, BLK was dedicated to covering Black LGBTQ voices, with profiles of Audre Lorde, Marlon Riggs, Winnie Mandela, RuPaul, and more.
My dad picked up a printing press off of the street. It was junk, and he wanted to make it work because he was into technological things, and it wasn't so much he was into printing. He just wanted to make this machine work. I sometimes say that if he had picked up an airplane, I'd be a pilot. But literally, printing was something that I kind of grew up with. I had refused the draft. This was during the Vietnam War, and I had been convicted and sentenced by the court to work 2 years in a mental hospital in Los Angeles at LA County General. I wanted to go to New York because I had friends in New York. And I asked my probation officer, could I go to New York? And he said, no. He said, the court said that you have to do this, you know, in Los Angeles and all. I went to New York anyway. I got a job at Bellevue Hospital. I called my probation officer and I said, hey, I'm in New York. I did what you said. I got a job at Bellevue. And he said, I didn't tell you could go to New York. You better get back here. You're in violation of the court order. And I said, well, but I'm already here. I got the job, just like you said. And he said, well, I'll see if I can modify the court order. And they modified the court order so that I could stay in New York. So now I'm in New York, and I start to do printing like I did in LA. I do flyers for friends, and then it's flyers for friends of friends. And I am now in the gay community in New York. And I'm much more out than I was in Los Angeles. And one thing leads to another. And I kind of start a little printing business. I eventually wind up with a loft in the West Village. And I have a space for my printing business. And I have become, at this point, kind of typesetters, printers to the gay community, to the LGBTQ community. Well, LGBT, no Q back then. I also made contact with Frances Green, who was head of Gayellow Pages. And she was doing Gayellow Pages on a typewriter. But by that time, I had professional phototype equipment, and we made an agreement that I would help transition Gayellow Pages to modern technology, and she would help me in the typesetting printing business. Well, Gayellow Pages was a directory of LGBT organizations, businesses, community centers. Frances Green decided that it would be good to have a directory of organizations nationally. She's the one that did that. One of the things that's interesting about Frances Green, all of the work and time and money that she put into Gayellow Pages, she was a straight woman. She was or is an ally. She didn't do it for New York. It was national. That was significant along the track that we're talking about here, because that kind of gave me and the typesetting credibility, because I had now access to all of that. I mean, all the people that came in for Gayellow Pages would also now, oh, you need this? Well, there's Alan right there, you know. So Francis Green's desk here is here, and my desk is here, and one hand is washing the other. So that goes on for a while, and at this particular time, New York did not have a gay newspaper. None, zero, right. At the time, San Francisco had BAR, and Boston had Gay Community News, both of which were very respected. And there was a paper in Toronto called Body Politic, right? But in the United States, we only had San Francisco and Boston. There would be people who would come to me and say, hey, you know printing and you know typesetting and all, we want to start a newspaper. I mean, I'm the obvious guy to help make that happen, of course, right? Intertypographics was the name of the company, and our slogan was, we know your type. The one that most seemed to happen was one called Gotham Ledger. And I think he did like maybe 3 issues, maybe 4 issues, and then it folded. And by this time, I'm looking at Gotham Ledger, and I'm looking at what I can do, and I'm looking at Francis Green, and I'm thinking, I can do this. I can do this, right? And it started out as a calendar of events, because we didn't have a lot of news. There were a few news stories. I had in mind for it to be a respected newspaper, so it was going to be a tabloid. I knew that I wanted to be that size. I think maybe I had the Village Voice in the back of my head. That was the beginning of Gaysweek. And with that beginning, then the puzzle pieces started to fall in place, because New York was ready for a paper, which meant that writers kind of came to me, and photographers came to me, and people with news to be in the paper came to me, and then it was organizing this into a paper, and I wound up doing what I have come to know that I do best, which is to organize things, so that in terms of journalism and the newspaper business, if there is an editor who's responsible for the content, and then there is a publisher who's responsible for making it happen, finding the money, organizing things, making deals with blah, 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 blah. I held both hats, but the one that was most important, and the reason why Gaysweek continued and the other publications didn't, is I think because I knew how to do the publisher part. I was editor all the way through except for the last issue when I came back to LA. Okay. I was editor. There were other people that had other roles. We had eventually had news editors, and then we had a hierarchy, and there were people, there was arts editors and all of that. But I was still the guy who was editor. And I think that I remained editor not because I felt the need to hold on to that. I don't think anybody else wanted that task. One of the things about Gaysweek is that Gaysweek was not a business in the sense that everybody got paid. It was an all-volunteer operation from day one to when it ended. Nobody got paid, right? So since nobody got paid, the editor and the publisher roles, which were central to making it happen, this crazy man had to do it because I was doing it for free. Whereas the other roles were smaller. The person who wrote the book reviews, or the person who, did X or Y, they could contribute that time without having responsibility for the whole thing. So they let me do that.
Exactly.
I knew what the New York Times did. I knew what New York Magazine did. I knew what the New Yorker did. I knew what the Village Voice did, right? And so we were an LGBT, I keep wanting to say Q now, publication. So we were doing what those folks would do, except for our community. So the idea of interviewing the important people in the community, it's a no-brainer, right? The idea of having interviews, I didn't make that up one day and say, hey, we need to do interviews. Well, no, that's what publications do. Publications do interviews, right? I wanted Gaysweek to be taken seriously, not just for ego reasons, but because the community needed a serious source of news. It needed a place where people could go to find out what was going on, And so that started out as the calendar of events, but then it started out as to what was going on, like politically, and what was going on, culturally, and all of that stuff. And it just kept getting, we added on to it bit by bit by bit. And as we added on to it, I did begin to think of ourselves, not in the beginning, but I began to think of ourselves as the New York Times of the community, that we were the paper of record, that if it happened, we needed to cover it. I remember early on, we had been around 6-8 months or something. There was a fire in the Everard Baths. It was a bathhouse in Midtown, which was very, very popular, and it had a fire in there. There were a number of stories that were circulating as to, why the fire and why people got killed. I think 8 people got killed, including Jimmy Stewart, who was the head DJ at 12 West. 12 West was one of the premier discos at the time, and DJs were really revered. I don't know if I want to say more so than now, but certainly they were revered, and the fact that Jimmy passed in the during the fire made it all the more noteworthy. We actually issued an extra that week. So here we have this all volunteer publication that's coming out somehow every single week, but the week of the fire, we published an additional issue. I think it came out 2 days after the fire. I really thought of Gaysweek as being a paper for the entire community. And although there wasn't the polarization that we have now, there were still disagreements. So for all the things ways that we emulated, or we tried to emulate other publications, there was one thing that we did not have. We did not have an editorial page. And that was a publisher-editor decision. We'll provide the news, and then what you want to do with the news, whether or not you want to march in the streets, or whether you want to write letters, or you want to ignore it, or whatever, that's for somebody else to do. My job is to provide the news. What I really like to do is to have two people kind of face off with each other and talk about the same thing from various points of view. Along those lines, if Gaysweek were running today, I would love to run an article on gay people who support Trump. It was a time of sexual freedom. We would list all the bars, or we would talk about, cruising the piers, or we would talk about, Central Park, or we would talk about, various things on an ongoing basis. There was, I do remember there was one cover story that we talked about cruising the piers. Yeah, we talked about the gay cruising spots. I personally remember them, and so I'm sure that that particular article was very well researched, because it wasn't just a matter of the piers or the subways or the backroom bars, but each one of them had a particular personality. I remember that when I tell this story, folks just their mouths open. But up and down the subway at the time, the bathrooms were like little backroom bars. On Sunday morning, I think it was either the N line or the RR line. It was one of the lines that was less used, and it was somewhere around the village. The bathroom off of that line on Sunday morning was where black gay men got together to have sex. Only Sunday morning. If you went there Saturday morning, you didn't have the same guys. And during the week, you didn't have the same guys. But I think everybody somehow knew that Sunday morning on this particular line was the time that black guys get together to have sex, right? We were maybe halfway through the Gaysweek run, and we got a letter in the mail from Newsweek, from their lawyers. And Newsweek, it was a cease and desist letter to no longer use the name Gaysweek because it was too close to Newsweek. And I remember as plain as day the time that came in the mail, because my first impulse was, yes, we're being sued by Newsweek. you know, let's get some letters out, let's get the press releases out, and we did that. We did. We told as many people as we could that we were being sued by Newsweek for this stupid ass cease and desist letter. There were some maybe 60 or 70 people that worked on Gaysweek, making it happen every week. And these days, I look at those issues, some of which were 16 or 32 pages, and it's kind of like, how did we do that? And part of the way we did that is that we're so many people, each doing, like a little bit. For all the reviewers, for all the writers, for all the lawyers that we were able to find, what we were never able to find on a continuing basis was somebody to sell advertising. If we had found somebody to sell advertising, I think the whole fortunes of Gaysweek would have changed. And as I look back on it, and I think I knew it at the time, it's kind of fun to write reviews. It's kind of fun to do news articles. It's if you're a lawyer, you're not going to be called upon a lot, so you can offer your services. But who wants to sell advertising, right? We weren't able to attract enough advertising to forget about paying salaries, simply to pay the bills for the publication to continue to exist. At the same time that we don't have anybody selling advertising to pay the bills, Gaysweek is growing in terms of size, in terms of reputation. We now at this time have an arts supplement. It was called Arts and Letters. It was a supplement that happened once a month, because Gaysweek itself was a hard news publication. It didn't have room for poetry or fiction or any of that. I decided to shut it down, not because it was failing. I shut it down because it was going sideways. It wasn't failing, but it wasn't taking off either. When the typesetting in Gaysweek started, I was in a loft on 13th Street. And there came a time when I left that loft, and when I left that loft, I didn't have any place to live. I moved into the offices of Gaysweek, which was on 18th Street, and slept on the floor. And there's a term for that, it's called homeless. And I had never thought of myself as homeless until I was telling the story, a while ago, and somebody said, well, yeah, you were homeless. I think that contributed to the ending of Gaysweek, because I couldn't go home and separate myself from it, right? I'm not proud of this, but this is the way that it ended. I typed a letter to Francis Green, who was still involved in the organization, and said that I was leaving and going back to California, and I locked the office and I left. I come back to Los Angeles, and it's kind of like, oh, the weight of Gaysweek is off of my shoulders, and I get a job working in a typesetting company, making percentage-wise, making probably maybe not more money than I've ever made, but close to it. I bought a BMW. I bought my house. One of the things that changed, I at the time thought of myself as a gay man, but didn't really think of myself particularly as a black gay man. By the time I was in Los Angeles, I discovered that I was a black gay man in a way that was not clear to me in New York. I'm no longer hanging out in the mainstream gay and lesbian community. I am hanging out in the black LGBT community. And so I'm hanging out with Phil Wilson, I'm hanging out with Carl Bean, I'm hanging out with Jewel Williams. These are all big people that are in Los Angeles community. Well, Phil Wilson is big in the HIV community. Jewel Williams owned Catch One, which is the biggest gay bar in Los Angeles. Carl Bean started Unity Church, which is the biggest black gay churches across the nation. I'm becoming a little bit radicalized. I'm seeing things through a different lens, right? Minority AIDS Project was doing the usual things to help stem HIV. Posters on walls and slogans and all of that. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, you could do that, but people don't like wearing condoms, and it can be fun, but we need to actually actively do that in some kind of way. Now, they're a nonprofit organization with government funding, so they can't throw sex parties. But I'm an individual person, so I can throw a sex party. And that's how Blackjack was born. Blackjack was born out of the AIDS movement, and it was born because I wanted to be in a room with people who understood safer sex, were not afraid of it, and wanted to participate in safer sex. I gathered like-minded people around us, and we started Blackjack. And Blackjack, we call them meetings. So we had Blackjack meetings every month, basically sex parties, but we had these rules. But everybody was self-policing. So we didn't have to go around with flashlights and say, hey, you don't have a condom on. If somebody started to do something without a condom, everybody in the room would call them out, because we had a critical mass of people who believed in what we were doing. We had our meetings at hotels. You had to fill out an application. I look back at this and I'm saying, God, how did we do this? But the whole application thing was a hoop for people to jump through to make sure that they believed in what we were doing. It wasn't so much that we were going to do anything with the application. It's kind of like, if you are into this enough that you're going to write all this information on a piece of paper, we're going to let you through the front door. Name, address, telephone number, what sort of things do you like to do? Why do you want to come to the meetings? But nobody ever got turned away. It was the fact of filling it out that was the point. There was a similar thing with regard to race, because it was called Blackjack because it was for black men. There was a racial question on there. We never turned anybody away, but the fact that we said that it's a sex club for black men was designed for people to self-select themselves out. But if they chose not to take the hint, then they got in, you know? And one of the things that I kept thinking was, you know, I have a room full of men here at a hotel, all naked, all having sex. You know, I'm kind of responsible for their safety. There was a two-part process. If they were verified, we would give them the exact location of the hotel. But if they had never been there before and had just filled out an application, they still had one more hoop to go through. And we met them someplace other than the hotel, generally a fast food restaurant or something. And then once they would come there, we would verify the information that was on the application, and then they would be given the hotel address, and they only had to do that once. So yes, people would come in and they would take their clothes off, put them in bag. We had food, we had stuff to drink, we brought VCRs with porno that was playing in one room, and then there was another room where the sex took place, where there was music, and it was very light. So people could come in and they could socialize in the non-sexual rooms. There was always two rooms. After we were doing this for a while, Minority Age Project asked to come to our meetings. And I thought that was so cool because it gave us credibility, but it also helped with what the idea was, that that it had a safer sex impetus behind it. And then at one point we would say, okay, everybody, you know, stop what you're doing, come on in, and we'd all come into the living room area. And we'd turn on the lights, and then Minority Age would give like a 15, 20-minute presentation, how to put on a condom or blah, 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 whatever they were gonna do for 15 minutes. And then after that, we'd turn off the lights. Okay, all right, now go back and practice what you just learned. At this time, I'm putting out flyers about the events. And so then the flyers turned into a newsletter. And then the newsletter started out with being one page backwards and forward, back and front. And then the newsletter turned into a 4-page, and then it turned into an 8-page newsletter. We started to talking about community things. And there were classified ads in it, etc. And at some point, you know, the light bulb went on, and it was kind of like, you need to start a publication like Gaysweek for our community here. So all this is kind of happening at the same time, right? And from that, BLK was born. The first issue of BLK was December 1st, 1988. Is, guess what? A calendar of events with very big type for the dates and very big type for the events. I decided that it was going to be a monthly rather than a weekly. Again, because of what I've went through, there was a lot more planning. You know, we had meetings with all the stakeholders and the important people in Los Angeles. Again, Carl and Jewel and Charles Stewart, and kind of like set up roles in advance and thought about how the whole thing was going to be financed, etc. And decided that, unlike Gaysweek, BLK was going to be 4 publications. That BLK, the news magazine, which is the reason why this whole thing was set up. But to pay the bills, there's going to be a glossy black gay male porno publication that's going to pay the bills. More like Playboy. It's going to be sexy, and there's going to be pictures, but there's also going to be some content in it. And we thought that would be sellable. But because I now have a new political consciousness, it's not enough just to have a publication for black men. We need a publication for black women as well. Right? So we start Black Lace. Black Lace is the companion to Blackfire. And the last one is Kumba, which is a poetry and arts journal. BLK was to come out monthly. Blackfire was to come out bi-monthly. Black Lace comes out quarterly, and Kumba comes out twice a year. That was the game plan. If Gaysweek was a combination of the Village Voice and New York Times, then BLK is a black LGBT version of Newsweek or Time. It was tabloid sized. It was heavily focused on news, single panel cartoons, just like the New Yorker did. So we stole that from the New Yorker. I wrote all the captions, and somebody else did the drawings. I knew that I wanted cartoons in the very beginning, but I didn't have anybody doing them. So what we did was I stole the cartoons from Ebony Magazine and rewrote the captions to match the pictures, you know. And so some of the captions were kind of tortured because I had to figure out a gay and lesbian reason for the caption being what it was, right? But I think we did pretty well on that. And then I think by issue 4, I think somebody had called me up and offered his services as an artist. And from that point, then I wrote the captions, and he wrote did the drawings. We had interviews in them. We stole that from Playboy. Carl Bean, Audre Lorde, Phil Wilson. We interviewed 2 porno stars. We did Marlon Riggs, the filmmaker. There's a couple of issues that stand out. One is the issue that we did on HIV, which was a very serious cover story, and it talked about how HIV in the black community isn't just about HIV, but it's about race, it's about economic status, it's about education, it's about all those things. And we know that now. I mean, people talk about that with COVID and all of that. I mean, it's no big deal. But back then, folks were talking about HIV as just HIV and wasn't connecting enough with those other confounding factors, right? The other issue that I like was we decided to do an issue on the 10 best places for black LGBTQ people to work. There was a little write-up on each one. Very New York Magazine, just the kind of things they would do. I wanted to do it because it would be a cool thing to do, and I thought that it was useful, and the community liked it. And in fact, there was an organization that started up, I don't know, 6 months later or a year later, who does that now. And it's kind of like a whole organization, a whole nonprofit organization does what we just did for 1 month, you know. But, you know, we also covered, you know, we did an article on a porno star in issue 3, and then I think it was issue 5, we did Audre Lorde. I mean, what gay publication, at least at that time, you know, does that sort of thing? You know, most of them were put out by activists.
Artifacts is a free oral histories platform. Please like, subscribe, and visit our website, www.artifacts.movie, for an ad-free, interactive experience with bonus content. If you're able, please make a tax-deductible donation at www.artifacts.movie/donate. Hit the link on screen to watch another Artifacts interview.